Welcome back, and a reminder once again that your participation in this event is welcomed. Please send us your questions via our virtual conference room or on our social media channels. COVID-19 has impacted all of our lives, and it certainly has impacted governments, presenting some new challenges and exacerbating some old ones. We're going to talk now about the European perspective on protecting democracy in this time of COVID-19 with a woman who was named one of the world's 100 most influential people by Time magazine. She was highly instrumental in the adoption of Europe's GDPR, and she is now Vice President of the European Commission for Values and Transparency. Please join me in welcoming Věra Jourová. Thanks so much for being with us here today.
Thank you for your invitation. Thank you very much.
So the world is facing a pandemic, the economic fallout from a pandemic, and also a torrent of disinformation about the pandemic. Which one of these three things concerns you the most? And do you worry that one of them or all three of them in combination could pose an existential threat to European democracy?
Yes, thank you for this very difficult question. I am concerned about all the matters you have named. Of course, COVID-19 is first of all the big threat for our health and lives. And we are supporting the member states of the EU to do everything to protect the people in this direction. At the same time, economic issue and big economic gap, which we are expecting, which we want to heal by the new European budget. But also where I really tried to focus on a lot was whether the pandemic cannot somehow degrade and do harm to democracy and to our balance of powers in the EU. And also what you mentioned, the infodemic, which is one of the features of pandemic, which we see is dangerous not only for the health of the people, but also for the democracies, because it has a big potential to decrease the trust of people to institutions. And now we need the people to have good information, trustworthy information, not only in how to say, how to behave in pandemic, how to be best protected, but also to have good information, to be well-informed citizens and to trust the institutions. So this is the combination of factors. You are absolutely right. I think you said it at the beginning that all the negative trends which we saw already before COVID are now amplified. So we really have to deal with all these bad trends.
So you have called out China and Russia in particular for promoting some of this disinformation around COVID. What exactly do you expect to happen as a result of that call out?
First of all, we had to be open and say the truth about what we saw during the pandemic. And we have a lot of evidence that the activities of Russia and China in the virtual space, spreading some kind of information which might cause harm to European Union and European citizens, we have the evidence that it is there in increased intensity. Websites and social media accounts linked to China and Russia engaged in targeted influence operations and disinformation campaigns around COVID-19 in the EU, also in its neighborhood and also globally, seeking to undermine democratic debate and exacerbate social polarization, and also to improve their own image in the COVID-19 context. So we had to be open, and we had to share our evidence with the citizens to be aware of what's happening. But on China more generally, China is an important trading partner and at the same time a rival promoting another governance system. So these are the factors which we have to have in mind, and I am sure that the EU needs to stand up for its values and interests, and it means a more reciprocal economic relationship and standing up for our values and fundamental rights, especially in the digital society and economy.
But is that standing up for those values, is that going to change the Chinese behavior when it comes to disinformation? Or do you have to engage in some kind of sanctions regime if you really want to see change?
Well, first of all, we have to have an open debate with the Chinese partners. So you know that we are ahead of the summit, where also these new findings and the evidence we have should be discussed. We must not be naive. The EU did not manage to get our story out. Yeah, we left too much space, especially in digital platforms, unoccupied by our story and our information. And we clearly see that if we leave this space free, it is occupied by some others. And speaking about the foreign actors, Russia and China were mentioned as those who were very agile in doing so.
Just a short time ago, we presented the results of the Democracy Perception Index polling done by Dahlia Research. And one of their findings was that the world overall looked at the Chinese response to COVID-19 much more positively than the US response, certainly. Do you think that this opinion about the Chinese response is a reflection to some degree of the Chinese disinformation campaign around the pandemic?
It's hard to say because there is a lot of hesitation whether we can trust the information and the figures which are provided by China. So I think that we will still have to wait for some time to understand who was better managing the crisis and what is the result. I don't believe the story, which was also spread across Europe, that the regimes which are more authoritative can manage such crisis better. I believe that democracies like the EU countries are very much able to manage such crisis. But again, what I said before, by means of having well-informed citizens who can deploy their own responsibility and their own action to protect themselves.
That's a long-term solution, perhaps. A shorter-term one might be to ask the platforms to do more. I know that the European Commission at this point in time has asked the platforms to issue periodic reports on what they're seeing. Again, is this going to be enough to create change? Do you need something more forceful? Do you need regulation?
We need to do two things. We need to see digital space, which will take action against crime online and illegal content, which is child pornography, terrorism, extremism, and hate speech. This is the prohibited content according to EU law. But also we have to get the facts right online. And so we need more facts to appear online so that the people can compare different messages and have first-hand available facts which are verifiable. The facts belong to everybody. The opinions belong to each individual. So we want the platforms not only to report on what's happening in their system, what kind of disinformation, who might be the origin, what are the channels, what is the manipulative technique used, what are who are the targets, but also we want more fact-checking because we believe that the facts are important.
I want to ask you about a couple of recent news stories relating to the US. Facebook just yesterday pulled a Trump campaign ad because they said it had used a Nazi symbol within it. Given Mark Zuckerberg's often repeated statement that he's committed to free speech and doesn't want to be a policeman, were you surprised by what Facebook did?
The US is a different legal system, and its approach to the freedom of speech is different from the European one for very strong reasons. The freedom of speech is not unlimited in the EU. while the First Amendment of the American Constitution says that freedom of speech is unlimited. So I am surprised, but I have to say at the same time that I simply see that the big tech do not want to be the channels of pro-Nazi propaganda and the channels for lying and false information, that they are moving themselves. And also what Twitter is doing, that they are fact-checking now. I think that this is, from European perspective, the way it should be done, that the platforms are more proactive without censoring the opinions. Yeah, this is our approach. No censorship, just fact-checking and removing the illegal content. And pro-Nazi propaganda and the symbols, it is something which is prohibited on European territory.
Let me ask you another current question. It has to do with Twitter, which has taken some steps as regards to President Trump's tweets. There were a couple that it labeled with fact-checking warnings. Yesterday, there was a tweet that they said violated their manipulation guidelines and was removed. And yet, the president also tweeted in recent days about a 75-year-old protester who'd been knocked over by police and said this person was associated with Antifa, although he offered no proof of that. So there seems to be some inconsistency in the way Twitter is policing. And one, does it worry you? And two, does it indicate to you that perhaps they are bowing to political pressure?
I cannot judge it from my position, what's happening in the US context. The previous action of Twitter was something I supported publicly, because this was what we want them to do in the EU, to do the fact-checking. And let's be clear about that. We politicians, we should count with it that our speech will be fact-checked, because we have extreme influence, which is amplified by using the platforms and systems such as Twitter. So we have to count with it that our speech might be countered by some other speech, which are either other opinions or the facts, which might be delivered. So inconsistency, of course, the platforms use different internal policies and terms of work, and that's why also in Europe we will work more on establishing or developing some common rules which might bring more legal clarity in what should be happening in the world of the platforms. But again, no censorship. The priority of freedom of speech is absolutely clear, the right for information. These are our principles. And by the end of the year, we will come with the consistent approach, which will be a mixture of regulation and non-regulatory measures.
I want to bring in some of the questions from our audience. Again, my apologies to everybody whose name I will proceed to mispronounce. But we have one from Sanoj Renselp, who asks, how do you see the role of social media platforms in amplifying foreign disinformation? You've talked about that a little bit, but this question says, are they unwilling or are they complicit? And what can the EU really do short of social media platforms changing their business models?
Yes, indeed. We had a very big debate with the platforms before or at the beginning of COVID. It was the 3rd of March when we were sitting around one table and we were speaking about the dangerous information for the people which might endanger their health and life, but also about the foreign actors and foreign influence. And we agreed on the system, which is a combination of removing of the dangerous messages and dangerous advice relating to health, and also the fact-checking of the messages which might be more of some kind of propagandist content. So yes, of course, the platforms serve to everybody. Everybody now can be a journalist. Everybody can bring his or her opinions. For me, platforms are a more or less fantastic democratic tool. But at the same time, we see negative things. We see the algorithms which are used to sell better the products. And I have big doubts whether the algorithms which they use as a good element of their business model should be used to sell the politicians. Yeah, because this is privatization of public debate to a large extent. So these are the things which we are looking at, and we will come at the end of this year with a democracy action plan which seeks to protect elections and free political speech. There are many good things, but also bad things. It's fascinating. The internet can organize in a very quick time humanitarian aid, but also it can be the place where humanitarian crisis can be started or incited. So we have to do everything to address the negative trends and to leave it open.
So we've talked about foreign interference and foreign disinformation. Some of it is internally produced. What do you do about that?
The same thing. We, of course, never said that the disinformation is only coming from outside and that we do not have our own internal producers. Sometimes it's not easy to trace the origin, to find out who is the original developer of such messages. So that's why now we want the platforms to report every month on what are the coordinated, well-organized and intentionally produced disinformation. Here, I believe that the public, through these reports, will have a chance to see who seeks to manipulate them, because this is about manipulation.
Can I ask you one other COVID-related question? Contact tracing is said to be an important part of controlling the pandemic, and various apps have been created to help with that process. How do you feel about that? Is there potential that these will infringe on people's privacy?
Well, here comes our GDPR, because the pandemic and the extraordinary powers of the state, of the governments, and of those who deal with the crisis from health perspective cannot switch off GDPR. Yeah, this is still in force, and that's why the Commission I represent came with a very clear guidance on the principles and parameters of such tracing apps, which could be used, but which should also respect the limits and the provisions of the GDPR, which is mainly the voluntary approach. Nobody should be forced to enter such system, so it's up to the people to decide. Then the very limited period for storing such data. And the third thing is also connected with the time that these tracing apps should cease to function with the emergency time. So it is really extraordinary tool. And our data protection authorities in all member states are on the cases. They are consulted by the governments whether the tracing app they are developing and using is still fulfilling the conditions of the GDPR. Up to now, we do not have any alarming cases, but it's about tracing. When we speak about tracking, it's another story. There we said it is too intrusive and it should not be developed. But the voluntary access of the people to the systems is absolute pillar of what we want to see in all these instruments.
Thomas Dodd asks about the information operations in EU countries undertaken by state actors. What is the largest initiative undertaken by the EU to counter this? The Sputnik empire budget is 2.4 billion per year. What is yours to counter disinformation?
Yes, I don't remember the figures, but we increased the budget last year already because we started by the more focused action taken from the side of our external action service. So we have the units working in this field. We have increased the number of people working there. But I always say that the capacities and the budget, it's not the only factor which has to be taken into consideration, because in the EU, we have a unique system of cooperation between the Commission, the member states, professionals. We have all the member states on board on this. We have the platforms cooperating, and we have the civil society also contributing vastly to the fact-checking. For instance, we have the research area employed on that. So the system is invaluable, and I think that you cannot calculate everything in terms of money.
We have another question not related to technology from Jesus del Copenhagen. If the EU needs to stand up for our values and fundamental rights, why are we not doing so on Hong Kong and Taiwan?
Well, I heard Josep Borrell, the High Representative for Foreign Matters, yesterday in the European Parliament, who made a very strong declaration vis-à-vis Hong Kong and other places where we have to focus more from the point of view of the fundamental rights. So I would leave it for him to communicate on that. We have to do more and a lot on European territory, and also vis-à-vis the other places in the world. So I think that we are taking actions to the extent necessary and possible.
We're almost out of time, but I want to ask you, here we have this collection of people talking about democracy, its importance, its challenges. If you were going to give them one action step, one call to action, what would it be?
Yes, to protect democracy. It means to protect, first of all, the freedom of speech. Because when we realize we need to keep the high standards of free and fair elections as one of the basic pillars of democracy, to have them guaranteed in our member states, we need to have free speech guaranteed also, and the rule of law, which is the balance of power. So if I can now address the people who are listening to us, if you can do something in the good direction on these two principles, I will be very grateful.
And we have to leave it there. Věra Jourová, thank you so much for joining us here today and offering us your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and have a good day.
And to our audience, stay tuned. Coming up, there will be an interview with a former U.S. Secretary of State, John Kerry.